Hey, welcome back, friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight, settled in lights low, maybe a warm drink somewhere nearby. Tonight we're going somewhere together, not forward in time, but back, way back, to a Sunday morning, a kitchen, a breakfast table set with real butter, real eggs, a full rasher of bacon sizzling in the pan, and a family who had absolutely no idea that this was the last morning life would ever feel this uncomplicated. Here is something I need you to really sit with before we begin. In less than 4 months after that Sunday breakfast, butter would disappear from British shelves. In less than a year, eggs would become so rare that people raffled them off like lottery prizes, and within 2 years a single onion would sell at auction in a London office for the equivalent of over $20 in today's money. A single onion. That is what we're talking about tonight. Not just food, not just recipes, but what it felt like to cook when cooking became an act of survival, creativity, grief, and sometimes quietly an act of love. So if that sounds like your kind of story, and I think it does, then let's get comfortable and begin. But first, if you've been around this channel for a while, you already know the drill. And if you're brand new here, welcome, genuinely pull up a chair. Here's the thing, I pour a lot of heart into every story I bring you. And if this one moves you, surprises you, or teaches you something you never expected to learn tonight, would you consider leaving a like? It takes 2 seconds. It means the world, and it tells me to keep going deeper into history's quieter, more human corners. And hey, drop a comment down below. Tell me, where are you watching this from right now? Are you in bed, on the couch? Is it raining where you are? I genuinely love knowing. Sometimes the comment section feels like a little community of night owls, and I'm here for every single one of you. If you're not subscribed yet, the button is right there. No pressure, but if you stay until the end tonight, I have a feeling you'll want to. Now, let the lights go soft. Let everything else fall away. And let's go back to September the 3rd, 1939. It was a Sunday. And here's the thing about that Sunday that historians sometimes skip over because they are too busy with the politics, the ultimatums, the troop movements along the Polish border. It was beautiful outside. That's what the people who were there kept saying years later when they tried to describe it. A warm, golden, late summer morning. The kind of morning that makes you want to open every window in the house. The kind of morning that smells like fresh bread and cut grass. In homes all across Britain, families were doing what families did on Sunday mornings. Some were just sitting down to breakfast. Some were still in their dressing gowns pouring tea. Some had the radio on low in the background, the wireless they called it, playing light music while the kettle boiled. And on that particular Sunday, the wireless was about to say something that would change everything. At 11:15 in the morning, a tired, worn voice came through the speaker. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, speaking from the Cabinet Room at number 10 Downing Street. I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. Just like that. 11 sentences. Less than a minute on the radio. And the world cracked open. Now I want you to imagine something. You're sitting at a kitchen table in London, or maybe in a farmhouse in Yorkshire, or a terraced row house in Birmingham. The tablecloth has a small floral pattern, you've had it for years. Your cup of tea is still warm. On the table in front of you is a proper Sunday breakfast. 2 rashers of bacon, an egg fried in real butter, because butter is just butter. You don't think about it. It's just there. A thick slice of toast spread generously. A small pot of marmalade. Maybe a second cup of tea already waiting. This is Tuesday in 1939. This is just Tuesday. The bacon isn't precious. The butter isn't counted. The egg isn't rationed or powdered or replaced with something called mock egg mixture. It's just breakfast. You cannot know that in exactly 4 months, on the 8th day of January 1940, the British government will begin rationing bacon, butter and sugar. You don't know that within 2 years your weekly allowance of butter will shrink to just 2 ounces. To put that in perspective, 2 ounces of butter is roughly the size of 1 small matchbox. That's it. That's your week. You don't know that eggs, just eggs, ordinary eggs will become so scarce that they'll be allocated at 1 per person per week. And even that the government couldn't always guarantee. Months would go by where families received no fresh egg at all, just a packet of powdered egg sent over from America. You don't know any of this yet. You're just eating breakfast on a beautiful Sunday morning. And then the radio speaks. And somewhere deep in your stomach, beneath the warm food, beneath the tea, something shifts. Here is a detail that I think about a lot. When Chamberlain finished his broadcast, an air raid siren went off almost immediately across London. People who'd been sitting quietly at their breakfast tables jumped up. Children grabbed their gas masks. Families ran to shelters. It was a false alarm. The bombers weren't coming. Not yet. But the food on those breakfast tables, the half-eaten bacon, the cooling tea, the toast going soft, was left sitting there, abandoned in the rush. And when people came back inside, some of them stood in their kitchens for a long moment and just looked at what was on the table, because something had changed, even if nothing had visibly moved. Even if the bacon was still there, and the butter dish was still there, and the marmalade jar was still there, the world those things lived in was no longer the same world. Now let me take you across the Atlantic for a moment. Because while Britain was already bracing for the long shadow of war, Americans were watching from a distance, concerned, yes, but not yet involved. Not yet rationing, not yet planting vegetable gardens in their front yards. The American kitchen in 1939 and 1940 was a place of relative abundance. Sugar flowed freely, meat was cheap, butter was something you bought by the pound without a second thought. But December 7th, 1941 changed all of that. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the bombing of the United States naval base in Hawaii, pulled America into the war overnight. And within weeks the government began building the machinery of rationing that would reshape how every American family cooked, shopped and ate for the next 4 years. By the spring of 1942, Americans were being issued their own ration books. Red points for meat, fish and dairy, blue points for canned and bottled goods, 64 red points per person per month, which sounds like a lot until you start doing the math at the butcher's counter. And here is the thing that strikes me most about this moment in American history. The United States, unlike Britain, was not an island nation under naval blockade. America was not being starved by enemy submarines prowling the ocean. The farms were still there, the cattle were still there, the food existed. But the country chose to ration anyway, because the food was needed elsewhere, for troops fighting in the Pacific, for soldiers crossing the Atlantic, for an entire continent of European allies who were in many places already going hungry. And that choice, the choice to give up abundance voluntarily for the sake of people you would never meet, is one of the quietest forms of courage in all of history. I don't think we talk about that enough. Let me introduce you to someone. Her name was Nella Last. She was a housewife in Barrow-in-Furness, a shipbuilding town on the northwest coast of England. In 1939 she was 50 years old. She kept a diary. Not a secret diary, she was actually one of thousands of ordinary British civilians recruited by the Mass Observation Project, a social research organisation that asked everyday people to write down what they were thinking, feeling and doing during the war. And what Nella Last wrote is extraordinary. On that first Sunday of the war, she wrote about sitting with her family listening to Chamberlain on the wireless. and then she wrote about going into her kitchen afterward. Not because she was hungry, but because the kitchen was the only place that felt real. She wrote that she put the kettle on again, even though she'd already had tea, because the act of doing something ordinary, something with her hands, was the only thing that kept the panic from rising. The kitchen, she realized, was going to be her war, not the battlefield, not the factory floor. The kitchen, the kettle, the flour bin, the small weekly package from the butcher. That was going to be where she fought. And she was right. Because what the history books often get backwards is this: the war did not come to the kitchen. The kitchen was asked to go to the war. Governments on both sides of the Atlantic understood something very clearly. Food was not just fuel. Food was morale. Food was civilization. If you could keep people fed, even modestly, even creatively, even on tiny allowances of butter and sugar, you could keep them fighting. You could keep them believing. You could keep them human. And if you couldn't, well, history has plenty of examples of what happens when a population goes hungry long enough. In Britain, before the war, the country imported roughly 22 million tons of food every single year. Nearly 2/3 of everything the British ate came from somewhere else. 60% of its sugar, 70% of its cheese, almost 80% of its fruit, more than half of its meat. Now imagine what happens when German submarines, the U-boats, start hunting every cargo ship that tries to cross the North Atlantic. In 1940 alone, the Germans sank over 1,000 merchant vessels. Each ship that went down carried not just crew members, God rest them, but tens of thousands of tons of food that was never going to reach British shores. The math was terrifying. And the British government, watching the numbers, made a calculated decision. If they could not bring enough food in, they would have to control how much food went out. Out of pantries, out of kitchens, out of mouths. Rationing wasn't punishment. Rationing was arithmetic. But understanding why rationing existed is very different from understanding what it felt like to live inside it. And that is where most history books go quiet, because the facts are easy to find. 2 ounces of butter per week, 1 egg per week when available, 4 ounces of bacon, 8 ounces of sugar, 1 shilling and 10 pence worth of meat, which, depending on what you were buying, might be a very small piece of something, or almost nothing at all. The facts are easy, but what was it like to be a mother standing at a kitchen counter at 7 in the morning, staring at what was left in her ration book, trying to figure out how to make it feel like a real dinner? What was it like to make your children's birthday cake out of dried egg powder and artificial vanilla flavouring, when you hadn't seen a real egg in 3 weeks? What was it like to stretch a Sunday roast across 3 meals, to skim the fat off the top of the stock because that fat was precious, that fat was your cooking grease for the rest of the week? What was it like to feel hungry, genuinely, quietly hungry, and feel guilty about it because at least you weren't the boys in France? That is what we are here to explore. That is the story underneath the history. I'll be honest with you. When I first started researching this story, I thought it would be a story about deprivation, about sacrifice and scarcity and making do. And it is that. But it's also something else entirely. Because when I started reading the diaries, the letters, the handwritten recipe cards from that era, I kept finding something I didn't expect. Ingenuity, humour even, and an almost stubborn, defiant kind of joy. A British Ministry of Food leaflet from 1942, encouraging housewives to cook with carrots, cheerfully suggested that carrots were sweet enough to use as a substitute for sugar in cakes. And it wasn't wrong. People actually did it. They made carrot cake, which, by the way, you can still find in every coffee shop in Britain today, and probably in yours too, not because it sounded delicious, but because it worked. That's a small story, a sweet one, but it captures something true about what happened in the kitchens of that era. When everything is taken away, you find out what you're actually capable of. And it turns out people are capable of a great deal more than they realize. Tonight, we're going to walk through those kitchens together. We're going to open the ration books. We're going to smell the bread baking without butter. We're going to sit with the women who ran those kitchens like field generals, managing supplies, improvising with almost nothing, and still somehow putting a warm plate in front of their families every single evening. We're going to meet the scientists who turned wartime hunger into an unexpected public health revolution. We're going to step into the black market where rules bent and desperate people made difficult choices. We're going to listen to what soldiers ate on the front lines and how those terrible military meals accidentally invented half the convenience foods in your kitchen today. And at the end, we'll ask a question that I think is worth sitting with. What do we still carry without knowing it from those kitchens? What habits, what flavors, what instincts are still running quietly in the background of how we cook and eat, handed down from a generation that learned to make something from almost nothing? The answer might surprise you, but we start here, on that sunny Sunday morning, September the 3rd, 1939, a breakfast table, butter on the toast, an egg in the pan, the last normal meal before everything changed. Picture this. It is a cold morning in January of 1940. You're standing in a line that wraps around the block outside your local Ministry of Food office. You've been waiting for 40 minutes. The woman in front of you has a baby on her hip. The man behind you is coughing into his coat collar. Nobody's complaining, nobody is pushing, because everyone knows everyone in this line is here for the same thing. When you finally reach the front, a tired-looking clerk slides a small booklet across the counter toward you. It is roughly the size of a postcard. Brown paper cover, your name stamped on it, your address, your national registration number, inside page after page of tiny printed coupons arranged in neat grids. Each one is worth something specific. Each one will buy you a precise government-decided amount of a precise government-decided food. And as you walk home holding this little booklet carefully, more carefully than you've held anything in a long time, something settles over you. Not quite fear, not quite relief, something in between. Because you understand in a way you couldn't have understood the week before that this tiny piece of paper in your hands is no longer just a document. It is your food supply, all of it, for the week ahead, the ration book. Of all the objects that survived from the Second World War, the helmets, the medals, the photographs, the letters, none of them captures the texture of daily civilian life quite like the ration book. It's not dramatic enough to go in a museum case next to a fighter pilot's uniform. It doesn't have the weight of a bayonet. It won't make you catch your breath the way a handwritten letter home does. And yet for tens of millions of ordinary people on both sides of the Atlantic, it was the single most important document they owned. More important in some ways than their identity papers, because without money you might still eat. But without your ration book you weren't eating. That's all there was to it. Let me walk you through what this actually looked like in practice, because the details matter here. In Britain, rationing officially began on the 8th day of January 1940. The first items rationed were bacon, butter and sugar. Not coincidentally, the three things that make almost every other food better. Take away bacon, butter and sugar, and you haven't just removed three ingredients. You've removed the backbone of British home cooking, the fat that you fried everything in, the sweet that made life bearable, the cure that preserved meat through the winter. By March of that same year, meat was added to the list. But here's the thing that surprised me when I first read about it. Meat wasn't rationed by weight. It was rationed by price. Each person was allocated the equivalent of 1 shilling and 10 pence worth of meat per week. In today's terms, that's roughly the purchasing power of about $2. which meant that if you wanted a cheaper cut stewing beef perhaps or offal, your money went slightly further. But if you wanted something finer, something that looked like a proper Sunday joint, your $2 worth of meat was going to look very small on the plate. Most families chose the cheaper cuts, and over time, over years of choosing the cheaper cuts, something interesting happened. Recipes that had previously been seen as peasant food as the cooking of the poor became the staple of every household. Oxtail stew, tripe, pig's trotters, dishes that the middle classes had never touched before the war became the dinner on their table. Necessity has always been the great equalizer. Now I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever thought about what it would feel like to have someone else, not your family, not your budget, but your government, decide exactly how much of every food you were permitted to eat? Not as a diet plan, not by choice, but as law, because that is what the ration book represented. And what's remarkable is that most people, at least at first, accepted it, even welcomed it. A survey conducted by the British Institute of Public Opinion in early 1940 found that 60% of those questioned believed rationing was necessary. Only 28% were against it. The remaining 12% were simply undecided, and that survey was taken before things got really tight. There's a report from a mass observation fieldworker, that social research project I mentioned earlier, where ordinary people wrote about their daily lives who spent time observing conversations in grocery shops during the winter of 1939 before rationing had even begun. And what he wrote down has stayed with me. He noted that this one sentiment, this one exact idea, was expressed both by shopkeepers and their customers over and over again across different shops and different days. I'll be glad when they start rationing. It'll put an end to all this. All this was the chaos of the months before rationing, the panic buying, the hoarding, the way that wealthy families swept entire shop shelves bare while poorer families arrived to find nothing left, the humiliation of queuing for an hour and reaching the front to find the shelves empty. Rationing, when it finally arrived, felt to many people like fairness. For the first time in their lives, the woman from the row house in East London had the same official entitlement to butter as the woman in the townhouse in Kensington. Whether that fairness was real or whether it was mostly theatrical is a different story, and one we'll get into. But the idea of it mattered enormously. The mechanics of the system were surprisingly intricate. In Britain, you didn't just receive a ration book and take it wherever you pleased. You had to register with a specific butcher, a specific grocer, a specific dairy. Once you registered with a shop, that shop was your shop. You couldn't take your coupons elsewhere. You couldn't shop around for a better price or a more cheerful shopkeeper. You were theirs, and they were yours for the duration. And the shopkeeper in turn was responsible for you. He ordered stock based on how many registered customers he had. He kept records. He reported to the local food office. When you came in to buy your 4 ounces of bacon, and 4 ounces, just to be clear, is roughly 4 thin strips, not a generous pile, the shopkeeper would take out a pair of scissors, open your book to the correct page and carefully cut out the corresponding coupon. Clip. Done. That's your bacon for the week. There's something about that physical snipping, that irreversible little clip of the scissors, that I find oddly moving. Because it wasn't abstract. It wasn't a credit card transaction or a digital deduction. It was right there in your hands, the coupon here now gone, the stub left behind like a scar. And when the page was empty, it was empty. No exceptions, no extensions. Come back next week. Here is something that most people don't realise about the British ration book system. Losing your ration book was a genuine emergency. If you lost it, you had to go to the food office, sign a declaration explaining what had happened, and pay a fee of 1 shilling to get it replaced. 1 shilling doesn't sound like much, but remember that 1 shilling was also roughly what your entire weekly meat ration was worth. You were essentially paying a week's worth of meat money just to replace the document that entitled you to your meat. And during the interim, while the replacement was being processed, you ate whatever you had in the house, which might be nothing. One woman writing years later about her wartime experiences remembered the terror of leaving her ration book on the counter of a sweet shop by accident. When she went back for it, the shop assistant said they had never seen it. She wrote that she stood outside that shop and wept not quietly but openly on the street, in a way she hadn't let herself cry about the bombs, or about her husband being away, or about any of the larger, weightier sorrows of the war. The lost ration book broke her, when everything else had held. I think about that a lot. The way that the small practical losses, the ones that brush up against your ability to feed your children, can crack you open in a way that the enormous abstract grief cannot. Across the Atlantic, the American version of the ration book told a slightly different story. The first American war ration book, officially known as War Ration Book No. 1, though everyone just called it the Sugar Book, was distributed on the 4th day of May 1942. Let that date sink in for a moment. May of 42. That's 5 months after Pearl Harbor. And the very first thing rationed in America was sugar. Not meat, not butter, not gasoline. Sugar. There's something very American about that if you think about it. Sugar was the great democratic pleasure, the thing that sweetened the coffee, baked the cake, made the lemonade on a summer afternoon. To ration sugar first was to reach into the centre of everyday American comfort and say this too is part of the war now. By the following spring, the rationing program had expanded to include meats, fats, canned fish, cheese, and canned milk, and the system was managed by the Office of Price Administration, a new federal agency staffed largely by volunteers that within 2 years had grown to include more than 5,600 local rationing boards across the country, run by over 100,000 ordinary citizens. Think about that scale for a moment. 100,000 volunteers' neighbours, teachers, retired businessmen, housewives sitting on local boards, administering the food supply of the most powerful economy on earth. It was, depending on your perspective, either a remarkable act of democratic organisation or a slightly terrifying expansion of government into private life. Possibly both. The American point system was different from the British one, and in some ways more complex. Each person, every man, woman and child, including babies, was issued ration points every month. 64 red points for meat, fish and dairy. 48 blue points for canned and bottled goods. But, and here is where it gets interesting, the point value of individual items wasn't fixed. It fluctuated. The Office of Price Administration adjusted the point cost of different foods based on supply and demand. If canned salmon was plentiful, it might cost 8 points. If it became scarce, it might jump to 16. If it was almost completely unavailable, it could go even higher. Which meant that every American housewife essentially had to become a strategic analyst of the food supply. She wasn't just shopping, she was calculating, optimizing, making decisions that a commodity trader would recognize. Should I spend 12 points on the canned beef this week, or save them in case the point value drops next month? Is the pork shoulder worth 18 points, or should I piece together several cheaper items? Will there be enough red points left for the children's milk? Ann Dickerson. A child growing up in Mississippi during the war years remembered watching her mother study the ration books and the point tables the way other women studied the Bible, with that same combination of reverence and desperation, looking for guidance, looking for a way through. There was one more layer to the American system that I find endlessly fascinating: the ration tokens. Because when you bought a rationed item with your ration stamp, sometimes you were owed change. Not in money, but in points, and you couldn't make change with stamps. Each stamp was worth a fixed number of points. So in February of 1944, the Office of Price Administration introduced a solution, small flat tokens, about the size of a dime, made from vulcanized fiber, a kind of hardened paper because real metals were needed for the war effort, red ones for meat and fats, blue ones for processed and canned goods. 10 tokens equaled 1 point, and they had absolutely no cash value whatsoever. If you lost them, they were gone. Nobody would take them as payment. Nobody would redeem them for money. They existed only within the closed economy of the rationing system, and yet people kept them. People counted them carefully. People worried about losing them the way they worried about losing cash. Because in the world of 1944, America, these tiny fiber discs, these little coloured coins worth nothing outside of a grocery store, were as good as gold. That's what happens when you change the rules of scarcity. Worthless things become precious, and precious things sometimes become worthless. Let me give you a number that I think will stop you cold. In the United States, over the course of the Second World War, the government issued approximately 1 billion individual ration books. 1 billion, spread across a wartime population of roughly 130 million people. That's because the books were issued multiple times, new books for new rationing periods, for new categories of goods for different family members. 1 billion little booklets of coupons. 1 billion small negotiations between citizens and their government about who got to eat what and how much and when. And the system worked. Imperfectly, there was hoarding and there was black market trading and there was cheating. We will get to all of that. But on the whole, it worked. Food got distributed, troops got fed, the home front did not collapse, and for a brief strange period in American and British history, and in the histories of almost every nation touched by that war, food became a commons, a shared resource administered by collective decision, distributed by public will. Not because people were saints, but because the alternative was worse. I want to leave you with one more image from the ration book era, one that I think captures something true about what all of this felt like from the inside. There is a photograph taken in London in 1941. It shows a woman standing at a grocery counter in Chelsea. On the counter in front of her is spread out everything she's allowed to purchase for the week. Tea, sugar, butter, what the government called national butter, margarine, cooking fats, bacon, not spread out lavishly, not in generous piles, arranged carefully, almost formally, each item in its precise allotted amount, and the woman is looking at it, not with despair, not with gratitude exactly, with something more complicated than either. She's looking at it the way you look at a hand of cards you've been dealt, taking stock, planning, deciding what she can make. That expression on her face, that quiet, calculating steadiness, is, I think, the defining look of the wartime kitchen. Not glamour, not heroism, just a woman, her ration book and the week ahead, figuring it out. Something is nagging at me and I want to say it out loud before we go any further. When we talk about governments controlling food during wartime rationing, allocating, restricting, it's easy to imagine a kind of passive population quietly accepting whatever it's handed. People standing in line, people clipping their coupons, people making do. But that picture is only half the story, because on the other side of the ration book, on the other side of the government's desk, was something far more ambitious, far more calculated, and frankly far more fascinating than a simple policy of shortage management. There was a machine, a propaganda machine unlike anything the world had seen, aimed at something as intimate and as everyday as dinner. And understanding how that machine worked, who built it, what it said, and how it reached inside people's kitchens and changed the way they thought about food, is one of the strangest and most remarkable stories of the entire war. Let me start with a man named Frederick Markey. You probably don't know that name, but if you lived in Britain during the Second World War, you knew him by a different one. Uncle Fred. Frederick Marquet was the first Earl of Walton, and in April of 1940 Prime Minister Winston Churchill appointed him Minister of Food. He had previously been the chairman of a major department store, not a politician, not a civil servant, a retailer, and that background turned out to be exactly what the job needed. Because Walton understood something that most politicians miss entirely: you cannot change what people eat by telling them what to do. You change what people eat by making them want to do it. From the moment he took over the Ministry of Food, Walton didn't just run an allocation department. He ran a marketing campaign, one of the most sophisticated, most creative, and most far-reaching marketing campaigns in the history of modern government. And his product was the idea that cooking carefully, cooking simply, and cooking with whatever was available was not just practical. It was patriotic. So what did that campaign actually look like? Let me give you the numbers first, because they are genuinely staggering. Every single week for the duration of the war, the Ministry of Food printed and placed 40 million food facts advertisements in British newspapers. 40 million. Every week. To put that in perspective, the entire population of Britain at the time was roughly 50 million people, so statistically almost every household in the country was receiving at least one of these advertisements every 7 days. But Lord Walton Uncle Fred didn't stop there. Between March of 1942 and November of 1946, the ministry produced and distributed more than 200 short films called food flashes, which played in British cinemas before the main feature. Each of these films reached an estimated audience of 20 million people. 20 million. In cinema after cinema across the country, before the newsreel and before the film began, a cheerful voice would appear on screen telling audiences how to bone a herring properly, or what to do with a surplus of small potatoes, or why jacket-baked vegetables were just as good as roasted ones. And then there was the radio. On the 25th of June 1940, a new programme began broadcasting on the British Broadcasting Corporation Home Service. It aired 6 mornings a week, after the 8 o'clock news. It was called The Kitchen Front, and it was aimed explicitly and unashamedly at the person the Ministry of Food considered its most important audience, the British housewife. Not soldiers, not factory workers, not politicians. The woman in the kitchen, because she was the one deciding what got cooked, what got stretched, what got wasted, and what got saved. She was, in Lord Walton's view, the most strategically important person in Britain after the generals. The kitchen front featured a rotating cast of cooks, home economists and entertainers who came on air each morning to offer recipes, tips and gentle encouragement. Among the regulars were comedian performers known as Gert and Daisy, popular entertainers who made rationing sound almost like an adventure. There was Mabel Constanduros playing a warm-hearted working-class family. And there was a broadcaster named Freddie Grigswood, affectionately nicknamed Rice Pudding by his listeners, whose calm, avuncular voice became one of the most recognisable sounds of the wartime morning. At its peak, the kitchen front had 5.5 million listeners, 5.5 million people every morning pausing over their sparse breakfast to hear what they could make for dinner that night. And here's the detail that I find most remarkable about the show's success. According to the BBC's own listener research, its audience skewed heavily toward working-class housewives, a demographic the BBC had previously almost completely failed to reach. The war and the kitchen brought them to the radio. Now here I want to stop and ask you something. Think about the media you consume every single day. The podcasts, the videos, the social media feeds, the streaming services, all of it competing for a piece of your attention. And now imagine you are a housewife in 1941. You have one source of information that reaches you consistently. One voice that comes into your kitchen every single morning. One set of ideas endorsed by the government, promoted by entertainers backed by the full apparatus of the state. how much would that shape the way you thought? How much would it change what felt normal? Because that is precisely what happened. And what makes it so interesting is that unlike a lot of wartime propaganda, the kind that tells you to hate the enemy or fear the bomb, this propaganda was asking people to do something genuinely positive, not to destroy, to create, with whatever they had left. The Dig for Victory campaign is a perfect example of this. It began in October of 1939, even before rationing formally started, and it was at its heart a very simple idea. Every piece of unused land in Britain should grow food. Not flowers, not lawns, food. And the results were by any measure extraordinary. By 1943, the number of allotments in Britain had roughly doubled, rising to approximately 1,400,000 individual plots. Those allotments were collectively producing more than 1 million tons of vegetables per year. 1 million tons. Grown by ordinary people in their back gardens, on roof terraces, on railway embankments, in the moat of the Tower of London. Yes, that is real. The moat of the Tower of London was turned into a vegetable garden on the lawns of Kensington Gardens, which the Ministry of Food requisitioned and divided up for nearby residents to use as growing plots. Even Buckingham Palace was not exempt. King George VI personally had vegetable gardens planted at both Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. Because in wartime Britain the message was explicit. If the king is growing carrots, you can grow carrots too. By 1942, roughly half the adult population of Britain was actively participating in Dig for Victory in some form, and by the middle of the war, 70% of the food being consumed by the British people was home-produced. Before the war, the number had been 30%. Think about that shift. In the space of a few years, a nation that had imported 2/3 of its food learned to feed itself. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because someone built a machine to make it happen. Across the Atlantic, the Americans were running their own version of the same campaign, though with, it must be said, a distinctly American flair. By 1943, more than 20 million victory gardens had been planted across the United States, in backyards, in apartment building rooftops, in public parks, in hotel grounds. The San Francisco Golden Gate Park had victory garden plots. Boston's Fenway Park neighborhood had victory gardens that are still actively cultivated today, more than 80 years later. And the propaganda surrounding those gardens pulled in voices that no British ministry would have thought to use. Batman and Superman appeared in American newspapers and comic books, taking time off from fighting the Nazi villains to tend their tomato plants. Mickey Mouse called upon young gardeners to enter a green thumb contest, and Bob Hope's 11-year-old daughter Linda was photographed carefully placing bean sprouts in her own small garden, her contribution to the war effort documented and circulated by the government's press office. Even Vice President Henry Wallace got his hands dirty for the cameras. But the most famous victory gardener in America was also the one who faced the most resistance in getting her garden approved. Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady diplomat, social reformer, decided in 1943 that the White House lawn should carry a victory garden. President Franklin Roosevelt was not pleased. According to documents from the period, he reportedly asked federal scientists who were reviewing the White House soil composition to, and I am paraphrasing only slightly here, "Tell Eleanor the yard is full of rocks or something." The President of the United States personally tried to talk his wife out of planting a vegetable patch. Eleanor Roosevelt planted the garden anyway, and it produced a remarkable harvest. Back in Britain, the propaganda campaign had a few tricks up its sleeve that deserve their own moment in this story. One of them involves carrots, and a lie. A very deliberate, very creative government-sponsored lie. By 1942, the British Ministry of Food had done such a thorough job promoting carrot consumption. Carrots were plentiful, easy to grow, and required no ration coupons that the country was producing 100,000-ton surplus of the things, a surplus of 100,000 tons of carrots, which meant the government now had the opposite problem. They needed people to eat even more carrots than they already were. So they told a story. The Royal Air Force's night fighter pilots had been achieving extraordinary success shooting down German bombers in the darkness over Britain. The real reason was a secret, a new radar technology called airborne interception radar, which allowed British pilots to locate enemy planes before they could be seen. The government desperately needed to keep this technology secret from Germany, so instead they let it be known quietly through newspaper stories and official hints that the reason British pilots were so deadly accurate in the dark was simple. They ate enormous quantities of carrots. Carrots, the stories explained, improved night vision. The ace pilot John Cunningham, nicknamed Cat's Eyes, the first British pilot to shoot down an enemy plane using the new radar, was reported to have consumed prodigious amounts of carrots. People believed it. The idea took root across Britain and America. Parents told their children to eat their carrots so they could see in the dark. The myth once planted proved nearly impossible to uproot. And you know what? 80+ years later, many people still believe it. Have you ever been told that carrots help you see in the dark? That story was born in a government office in London in 1940, designed to hide a radar secret and sell a vegetable surplus. That is propaganda working at its finest, and its most absurd. But the most beloved characters in the Ministry of Food's campaign weren't pilots or poster slogans. They were a cartoon carrot and a cartoon potato. Dr. Carrot, a bespectacled root vegetable in a top hat carrying a little bag labelled with the words Vitamin A, appeared on posters in newspaper advertisements and in recipe leaflets all across Britain. Potato Pete, equally cheerful, equally cartoon bright, had his own recipe book, which the ministry distributed by the thousands. It featured potato soup, potato pastry, potato bread, and a poem that ended, "Here's the man who ploughs the fields, here's the girl who lifts the yield, that's the story, and here's the star potato, Pete eat up to tar." The ministry had even hired a Disney cartoonist, Hank Porter, who worked at Walt Disney Studios in California, to create an entire fictional family for Dr. Carrot. There was Carroty George, Pop Carrot, Clara Carrot, entire illustrated families of talking vegetables designed by Disney, produced to persuade exhausted British housewives to eat more roots. History is genuinely strange sometimes. The campaign worked so well on the potato front that by 1943, British farmers had actually produced too many potatoes. The switch from grazing land to potato fields had been so successful, the nation found itself with a potato surplus, which honestly, compared to almost every other wartime food story, sounds like a problem most people would happily have. What strikes me most deeply about all of this, and I want you to sit with this for a moment, is not the scale of the propaganda. It's not the 40 million weekly newspaper advertisements, or the 20 million cinema viewers, or the 5.5 million radio listeners. It's the intimacy of it. Government campaigns usually stay at a distance. They deal in policies, in laws, in budgets. They tell you what you may and may not do. But the Wartime Kitchen campaign went somewhere different. It went right into the domestic heart of daily life. It came through the radio at breakfast time. It showed up in the cinema before the film. It arrived in the newspaper alongside the crossword. It sat with people in the most private, most ordinary moments of their day. And it asked them gently, persistently, cleverly, to reframe the way they thought about one of the most fundamental human acts there is, the act of feeding yourself, the act of feeding your family. It asked people to see that not as a burden, though it was a burden, but as a form of participation, a way of being part of something larger than your own kitchen. And judging by the victory gardens and the allotments and the recipe letters sent into the BBC and the half of Britain that picked up a spade in the middle of a war it worked. It worked in a way that advertising agencies spend careers trying to replicate and rarely do. There is a detail from the BBC's own records that I can't quite let go of. The listener research department noted as the war went on, and rationing tightened further, that the popularity of the kitchen front had begun to decline. Not because people disliked it, not because the recipes had gotten worse, but because in the department's own careful words of, and I'm quoting this directly from their report, the housewife's increasing weariness of the whole business of catering under wartime conditions. The weariness, not anger, not despair, just tiredness. The deep, quiet, bone-level tiredness of someone who has been creative and economical and cheerful and resourceful every single day for years, and who just doesn't quite have it in her anymore to listen to another recipe for potato soup. I find that sentence more moving than almost anything else I've read about the wartime kitchen, because it tells you something that the posters and the propaganda films didn't bother to record. The campaign worked. The campaign genuinely worked, but it worked by asking an enormous amount from ordinary people, and eventually ordinary people got tired. Which is, when you think about it, the most human thing in the world. There is a cookbook I want to tell you about. It was published in Britain in 1942. It is a slim thing, 64 pages, modest cover, modest title. It is simply called The Kitchen Front. Inside you will find 122 recipes. Not one of them is glamorous. Not one of them calls for an ingredient that was by that point easy to obtain. But what makes this little book remarkable is not the recipes themselves. It's the philosophy underneath them. Every single recipe in that book begins from the same quiet premise: you have very little. But you are not helpless. And then it shows you precisely, practically, without condescension, what you can do with very little. That philosophy, I would argue, represents something genuinely extraordinary about the human capacity to adapt. Because what happened in the wartime kitchen was not simply a matter of people eating worse food. It was a matter of people thinking differently about food, reimagining what it was, what it could be, and what it owed them. And some of what they came up with was so clever, so surprising, and so stubbornly delicious that it has never entirely gone away. Let's start with the egg. The egg is, in retrospect, a perfect illustration of the wartime kitchen's central challenge. Eggs are in almost everything: cakes, custards, sauces, breads, pancakes, meringues. Even a lot of savoury dishes start with an egg. And during the Second World War, fresh eggs became one of the most tightly controlled, most rationed, most passionately missed foods in both Britain and the United States. In Britain, by 1941, the fresh egg allocation had dropped to roughly 1 egg per person per week, and even that couldn't always be guaranteed. There were stretches of weeks, sometimes months, when no fresh egg appeared at all. So the governments on both sides of the Atlantic came up with a solution: dried egg powder. The idea was straightforward in theory. Take a fresh egg, dehydrate it into powder, seal it in a can or a packet, and ship it anywhere in the world without the need for refrigeration. By the mid-1940s, roughly a quarter of America's total egg production was being dehydrated and sent to allies overseas. In practice, the reality of dried egg powder was, let's be honest, a good deal less inspiring than the theory. British housewives who received packets of the stuff, often arriving in tins under the American Lend-Lease aid program, had to reconstitute the powder with water before using it. The result, when scrambled or baked with, was often rubbery, flat in flavour, missing the richness and lift that a real egg provides. One wartime diarist described scrambled eggs made from the powder as tasting, quote, like warm yellow disappointment. And yet, and here is the thing that interests me, people made it work. They mixed it into batter, they folded it into pies, they used it in custards where its blandness mattered less because you were going to flavour the custard anyway. They learned which applications tolerated the powder and which ones absolutely didn't, and they adapted. Because you adapt. When you have to, you always adapt. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever eaten carrot cake? Almost certainly yes. It's one of the most popular cakes in the English-speaking world. You can find it in every coffee shop, every bakery, every supermarket refrigerator. Cream cheese frosting, little marzipan carrots on top, you know the one. That cake exists in its modern, widespread, beloved form because of the Second World War. During the war, sugar was among the most heavily rationed items on both sides of the Atlantic. But carrots, as you'll remember from our time together in the last part of this story, were plentiful, promoted and unrationed. And carrots are naturally sweet. Grated into a cake batter, they provide moisture and a quiet, gentle sweetness that requires less added sugar to make the whole thing taste like a treat. The British Ministry of Food actively promoted carrot-based baking throughout the war. Carrot pudding, carrot jam, carrot flan, carrot fudge, which, if you're wondering, is exactly what it sounds like, and which apparently tasted better than you'd expect, but not as good as the real thing. And carrot cake, which didn't need to taste like a compromise, it simply tasted like cake. A food historian named John Stolarczyk, who has spent decades studying this period, actually tried making many of the wartime Ministry of Food recipes. And his verdict on carrot cake was straightforward. It worked, because it was genuinely good, not merely serviceable. The war didn't invent carrot cake, but it pulled it out of the margins of cooking and put it on every British kitchen table. And from there, it went out into the world. The next time you order a slice of carrot cake, you're in a very small and slightly strange way tasting the Second World War. But of all the wartime culinary inventions, and there were many, none captures the spirit of the era quite like a recipe that most people in America today have never heard of. And it is, I think, the most audacious act of kitchen creativity that the entire war produced. It is called mock apple pie. And here is the thing about mock apple pie: it contains no apples, not a single one. Instead, it uses crackers, specifically a brand of buttery round crackers that were widely available in American grocery stores throughout the war. The recipe goes roughly like this. You take approximately 36 crackers and crumble them into the bottom of a pie crust. Then you make a syrup from water, sugar, lemon juice, cream of tartar and cinnamon. You pour the syrup over the crackers, you seal it with a second pie crust, and you bake it until golden. The crackers, as they absorb the syrup and soften in the heat, collapse and shift and break down into a filling that, and this is the part that sounds impossible, actually tastes like apples. It smells like apple pie, it has the texture of apple pie, and a professor of sensory science who studied the phenomenon in the post-war years concluded that most people blind tasting it genuinely could not distinguish it from the real thing. No apples, but real pie. The recipe was widely printed on the back of cracker boxes during the war, and it spread from kitchen to kitchen across the country. Women shared it in letters. It appeared in church cookbooks and home economics pamphlets. Some families made it so regularly that their children grew up thinking that was simply what apple pie tasted like, and were briefly confused years later when they encountered the real version. I find that story one of the most quietly extraordinary things about the wartime kitchen. Not because the pie was revolutionary, but because it reveals what the human mind will do when it is determined to have something. You cannot have apple pie fine. Watch me make apple pie. In Britain, the parallel story of wartime culinary reinvention is the category the Ministry of Food called simply mock dishes, mock cream, mock goose, mock duck, mock banana, each of them a small act of defiance against scarcity, each of them an attempt to recreate the feeling, the warmth, the familiarity, the pleasure of something that no longer existed in its real form. Mock cream was made by whipping margarine together with sugar, and if you were lucky, a small quantity of milk or condensed milk. The result was something that looked reasonably like whipped cream held its shape when piped onto a cake, and tasted depending on the quality of your margarine and the amount of sugar you were allowed, somewhere between pleasantly sweet and definitely not cream. People used it on birthday cakes, on trifles, on the kind of small celebration desserts that had to be made even in wartime because some occasions demand cake rationing be hanged. Mock goose, which sounds like it should be a children's book character, was a dish assembled from potato sage and apple, shaped and roasted to roughly evoke the form of a bird. It never fooled anyone about what it was, but it gave a Sunday dinner the feeling of occasion of ceremony that a plain plate of vegetables simply didn't provide. And then there was mock banana. This one requires a moment of pause because it is both the most desperate and somehow the most poignant of all the wartime substitutions. During the war, bananas effectively disappeared from both Britain and occupied Europe. They were an imported tropical fruit, and the cargo ships that once brought them had been diverted or sunk. British children who were born in 1939 and grew up during the war had in many cases never seen a banana, had never tasted one, knew them only as a word that adults used with a kind of distant, wistful fondness. The Ministry of Food's solution was to suggest a substitute mashed parsnip, mixed with a small amount of banana essence flavouring, spread on bread, and served to children as banana sandwiches. I'm going to give you a moment to sit with that. Mashed parsnip with banana extract on bread. Was it convincing, reader? It was not convincing. Children who ate it knew on some level that this was not banana. But some of them ate it anyway because it was sweet, and because the adults in their lives said it was banana, and because children generally believe the adults in their lives are trying their best. And maybe that is the truest and most heartbreaking lesson of all these mock recipes. They were not really about the food. They were about maintaining the feeling that life still contained pleasure, that some version of the things that mattered, the birthday cake, the Sunday roast, the fruit on the table, was still possible, even if what was actually on the table was technically parsnip. There is another wartime baking miracle I need to tell you about because it has never quite gotten the recognition it deserves. It is called wacky cake, or depression cake, or war cake. It goes by several names, and it was baked on both sides of the Atlantic in various forms throughout the war years. The recipe requires no eggs, no butter, no milk. It is made with flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, salt, vegetable oil, vinegar and water. You mix the dry ingredients. You add the wet. You bake. And it rises. It browns. It comes out of the oven smelling of chocolate and tasting genuinely, surprisingly, defiantly like cake. The trick is the chemistry. Vinegar reacts with baking soda to produce carbon dioxide bubbles, which give the batter its lift in the same way that eggs would in a conventional recipe. No eggs needed. The oil replaces the butter, providing moisture and richness. And cocoa powder carries enough flavour to mask what might otherwise seem missing. This cake was in its own way a small act of scientific creativity in the kitchen, and it worked not because the cook knew food chemistry, most of them didn't, but because someone somewhere had simply tried enough combinations until they found one that produced something worth eating. Trial and error, patience, and a refusal to accept that cake was now impossible. Wacky cake still exists today. You can find recipes for it all over the internet. It has found a second life as a popular option for vegan bakers who appreciate that it contains no animal products. What was born from wartime scarcity has become in the 21st century a recipe of choice. History is strange like that. What I keep returning to as I think about all of these recipes is a question that I find genuinely difficult to answer. Was the wartime kitchen a story of deprivation, or was it a story of creativity? And I think the honest answer is both, simultaneously, inseparably. The deprivation was real. People missed food. They longed for it. A British woman named Margaret Patten, who became one of the most celebrated food writers in post-war Britain, worked as a home economist for the Ministry of Food during the war. She spent years travelling across the country, teaching housewives to cook with ration ingredients, running demonstrations in town halls and factory canteens. She said years later that what she remembered most was not the inventiveness, it was the longing. The way women's eyes would light up when she mentioned a recipe that used real butter, even in a tiny amount. The way the smell of a cake, baking any cake made of whatever was available, could fill a kitchen with something that felt for a moment like normalcy. Food is not just fuel. It never has been. It is memory. It is comfort. It is the smell that makes you feel safe. It is the taste that takes you home. And in wartime, when every other source of comfort was under pressure, when the bombs were falling and the men were away and the future was uncertain, the ability to put something warm and sweet on the table was an act of enormous emotional courage. Even if it was parsnip pretending to be banana, even if it was crackers pretending to be apple, even if it was powdered egg pretending to be the real thing, the pretending was the point. The pretending said, we are still here. We are still cooking, we are still eating together, and we are not done yet. Quietly, I want to ask you something personal. Not about the war, about you. Think about the last time someone in your life was going through something genuinely difficult, an illness, a loss, a long stretch of financial stress, and they kept telling you they were fine. I'm fine. We're managing. It's not that bad. You probably sensed the gap between what they said and what was actually happening inside them. The way the smile sat a fraction too still. The way the answer came just a little too quickly. That gap between the public face and the private truth is exactly where I want to take you now. Because the wartime kitchen had a public face. It was cheerful. It was inventive. It was patriotic. It was the Dr. Carrot posters and the kitchen front radio programs and the Women's Institute recipe leaflets and all the bright, determined, forward-facing energy we explored together in our last 2 parts of this story. But behind that face, inside the diaries, inside the letters, inside the private moments that nobody was trying to document for the government, there was something else entirely. Something quieter. Something that the propaganda posters never mentioned, and something that I think matters enormously if we want to truly understand what it felt like to cook in that era. Her name was Nella Last. We've touched on her briefly before, but now I want to spend real time with her because she is one of the most remarkable human documents to survive from the entire Second World War. Nella was 50 years old when the war began. She lived in a terraced house in Barrow-in-Furness, a shipbuilding town on the northwest coast of England. She had a husband she referred to in her diaries always simply as my husband, never by his first name. She had 2 adult sons, one of whom went off to serve in the army. She kept chickens, she made dolls for charity. And from September of 1939 until almost the end of her life, writing for the Mass Observation Project, she wrote down what happened every single day. Not in polished prose, not with any expectation of being published or remembered, just what happened, what she cooked, what she thought, what she felt. And it is in those unguarded pages that the real story of the wartime kitchen lives, not the version on the poster, the version in the heart. Reading Nella Last's diaries, you notice something that takes a while to name. She was a gifted cook. That comes through immediately. She took pride in what she put on the table, in her ability to coax something satisfying out of very little. She found genuine pleasure in the act of feeding people, of seeing her family eat well. But underneath that pride, running through the diaries like a low current of electricity, was an anxiety that never quite went away. Not fear of bombs, not dread of the telegram. Something more specific and more domestic than either of those. The anxiety of the ration calculation. Every week Nella accounted for what she had, how much was left of the bacon, whether there were enough points for the tinned goods she needed, what to do when her allocation of cooking fat ran so low that she was scraping the last traces from the paper wrapper with a knife. She wrote about these calculations with a kind of weary precision that is almost painful to read. Not because she was complaining, she rarely complained outright, but because the calculations never stopped. From the moment she woke up to the moment she went to bed, some part of her brain was running the numbers. What do I have? What do I need? How do I make it last? And the weight of that, the unceasing low-level cognitive labour of managing scarcity accumulated over months and then years, in ways that the propaganda posters never showed you. Here is something I want you to sit with for a moment. Midway through the Second World War in 1942, the British government conducted a survey through a research organisation called the Wartime Social Survey. They asked people across the country how they felt about the food situation. The results were unexpectedly candid. Approximately half of the respondents said they did not feel they had enough food to stay properly fit. 63% said they opposed making rationing any stricter than it already was. And a significant number, particularly women, described what we would today recognise as symptoms of chronic low-level stress difficulty sleeping, persistent worry, irritability, a sense of never quite being able to rest. These were not dramatic breakdowns. Nobody was falling apart in the surveys. It was subtler than that. It was the kind of tiredness that lives behind the eyes, the kind of anxiety that you learn to fold away and carry quietly, because what choice do you have? Nella last captured it perfectly in one of her diary entries from the middle of the war. She wrote that she had begun to think about food in a way she had never thought about it before the war, as a problem to be solved rather than a pleasure to be had, and she noticed with something between sadness and resignation that this new way of thinking didn't switch off when she wasn't in the kitchen. It followed her, into her sleep, into her mornings before the day began. She was always in some corner of her mind managing the food. Across the Atlantic, the experience was different in texture but recognizable in essence. American women faced their own version of the calculation anxiety, though the American situation was in many ways less severe than the British one. America was not an island under naval siege. The shortages were real, but the country never came close to genuine hunger. And yet, one woman writing to her husband serving overseas in 1943 described going to the grocery store and standing in front of a nearly empty shelf where the canned goods had been, and feeling, in her own words, a kind of helplessness I didn't expect. Not despair, just helplessness. A sense that the ordinary act of feeding her family, which had always felt like something she controlled, was now happening to her rather than being done by her. Another woman, whose letter was preserved in a collection at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, wrote to her sister about the experience of planning a week's meals within the ration allowance. She said it felt like working a very complicated puzzle, except that if you made a wrong move, your children went without something at dinner. I never worried about food before, she wrote. Now it's the first thing I think about in the morning, and sometimes the last thing at night. The word before in that sentence is doing a great deal of work. Before the war, before the ration book, before food became not sustenance but strategy. There is a dimension of this psychological story that historians have only recently begun to examine closely, and I think it's one of the most important. It is the question of guilt. Not guilt about anything dramatic. Quiet guilt. Domestic guilt. The guilt of the person who has enough or almost enough in a world where others do not. Nella last wrestled with this. She wrote about it when she learned that families in the bombed areas of London were managing on less than she was. She wrote about it when she noticed that working-class families in her town were often better fed under rationing than they had been before the war, because for them the ration was actually more than they had previously been able to afford, while middle-class families like hers felt the restriction more acutely. And she wrote about it in a passage that I find remarkable in its honesty. She noticed that she sometimes felt hungry, actually physically hungry, not the vague wishing for more that comes from habit, but the real stomach-hollow kind of hungry. And she wrote that she felt ashamed of being hungry, because her son was in North Africa, and whatever he was eating or not eating out there in the desert heat, it was not a well-managed weekly ration calculated from the comfort of a kitchen. So the hunger stayed quiet, and the calculations kept running, and the smile held. I want to tell you about a Japanese housewife named Sakamoto Kane. She lived in Kochi, a city on the southern island of Shikoku during the war years, and she kept a diary too. In one entry she wrote about going to the community distribution centre and receiving only shrimp and swordfish, no pork, no beef, and describing the growing sense of shortage around her with a phrase that I find extraordinary. She wrote, "I have the feeling that little by little there will be shortages, but that in war we must aim for frugality even in small ways, and we must be careful about waste for the sake of the country." For the sake of the country. She was not complaining. She was not asking for more. She was accepting the shortage as her contribution, her offering her piece of the war. And there is something almost unbearable about that quiet acceptance when you hold it up against what we know about what Japan was asking of its civilian population at that point in the war. The sacrifice was total, the frugality was deep, and still in her diary on that particular evening, Sakamoto Kane was grateful for the shrimp and worried about wasting it. What strikes me reading these women's words across the distances of culture and ocean, and 80 years of time, is how consistent the experience was. Not the specific foods, not the specific systems, but the interior shape of it, the constant calculation, the guilt that sat alongside the hunger, the smile that held even when the mind behind it was running on tired, and the way that cooking, which had always been at its best an act of love and creativity and pleasure, became during those years something else, not unloving, not joyless, but weighted. Heavy with responsibility in a way that no recipe leaflet or radio program could quite address. Because the Ministry of Food could tell you how to make a casserole with turnips, but it couldn't tell you how to stop lying awake at 3 a.m. wondering if you'd planned the week's meals efficiently enough. It couldn't tell you how to feel when your child asked for a second helping and you had to say no. It couldn't tell you what to do with the shame of being hungry when your husband was somewhere in Europe eating whatever the army gave him. Those things lived outside the leaflets, in the private spaces, in the diaries nobody expected to be read. Nella Lass wrote something near the end of the war that I want to share with you because I think it is one of the most quietly devastating sentences in any wartime diary I have ever read. She had spent years managing the household with care and patience and considerable skill. She had learned to make do, to stretch, to substitute, to plan. She had fed her husband and herself and her sons when they were home on leave, and she had done it well. And she knew she had done it well. But she wrote that sometimes in the evenings after dinner, sitting in the kitchen with the dishes done and the rations counted for the next day, she had a feeling she struggled to name. Not sadness, not exactly, more like a low, steady ache. The ache of having spent years being very careful about something that should never require quite so much care. The ache of a person who has been responsible and competent and quietly brave, and who understands in some deep and wordless way that nobody will ever quite know how much that cost. Here is the final thought I want to leave you with from this part of our story. When we talk about the wartime kitchen, when we celebrate the ingenuity, the carrot cakes, the mock apple pies, the victory gardens, the cheerful broadcast voices telling you to make the most of your ration, we are telling a true story. But it is only the public face of the story. The other face, the one that Nella Last and Sakamoto Kane and the unnamed woman who wrote to her husband about standing in front of empty shelves and feeling helpless, that face is just as true and just as important. Because understanding that both faces existed and that ordinary people carried both of them at the same time every day for years, that is what it means to really understand what it felt like to cook in the Second World War. Not just the recipes, the weight of them. Let me put a question to you before we begin this part of the story, and I want you to answer it honestly, not the answer you'd give in polite company, but the real one. If your child was hungry, not dangerously hungry, not starving, but genuinely, persistently going to bed with an empty stomach hungry, and you knew that a few streets away someone had food, extra food that technically belonged to a system of rules that was supposed to ensure everyone got their fair share, would you follow the rules, or would you feed your child? Most of us in the privacy of our own honest reflection know the answer, and the people of the Second World War knew it too. Which is why the black market, that murky, uncomfortable, endlessly fascinating parallel economy, was not the province of gangsters and criminals alone. It was the province of ordinary people, mothers, farmers, shopkeepers, grandmothers with hidden bacon under floorboards, and city dwellers cycling into the countryside with empty baskets and coming home with something that would make dinner possible. The term they used in Britain was blunt and expressive. They called the black market traders spivs. Not a flattering word. It conjured a certain image, the sharp-suited man on the street corner goods, appearing from inside coat pockets, a wink and a quiet transaction, a character who existed just outside the law, just outside the respectable world, and who was, depending on your point of view, either a scoundrel preying on wartime desperation or a practical genius filling a gap that the official system left open. The British government's official position was clear. Under legislation passed during the war dealing on the black market could result in a fine of up to £500, a colossal sum at the time, equivalent to many months of wages for most working families, plus up to 2 years in prison, plus 3 times the total value of whatever you had been caught selling. 3 times the value, on top of everything else. Treason of the very worst kind. One member of Parliament called it. And yet, in March of 1941, just over a year into rationing, British authorities announced they had brought 2,141 prosecutions for food rationing violations. By the following month, that number had risen to 2,300, with conviction rates running at over 90%. 2,300 prosecutions in a single month, in a country where the newspapers were simultaneously running front-page stories about the patriotic spirit of the home front. Here is something that I think changes how you understand the black market, and it comes from a quiet personal recollection preserved in the historical record. An older man interviewed years after the war described growing up on a farm in rural England. Under the rationing regulations, farmers were permitted to slaughter a certain number of pigs per year. When they did, the corresponding amount was deducted from their household's meat allocation. The books were supposed to balance, but this man's family, like many farming families, killed 2 pigs and declared one. The second pig, he said, was hidden. One side of bacon was wrapped in muslin cloth and concealed beneath a false floor under the shop window. When the food inspector came to count the livestock, they found exactly what they were supposed to find, and then the inspector left, and the family had bacon for months. It was the best bacon I've ever tasted, the man said decades later. There is no guilt in that sentence, no hesitation, just the best bacon. Because in the moral arithmetic of a farming family that had raised that pig with their own hands, fed it with their own scraps, and built that false floor with their own tools, they did not experience themselves as thieves. They experienced themselves as people who had found a sensible way around a rule that they had never entirely agreed with in the first place. Now contrast that story with what was happening simultaneously across the English Channel in the streets of occupied Paris. If the British black market was a story of modest defiance, extra bacon hidden under floorboards, a quiet word with your butcher trading coupons with neighbours, the Parisian black market was something altogether different, more desperate, more morally complex, and more revealing about what happens when food security collapses entirely. Under German occupation beginning in 1940, France's official adult daily ration had dropped to approximately 1,300 calories. 1,300 calories. For reference, a moderately active adult needs roughly 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day simply to maintain basic function. 1,300 was enough, in the words of one French writer of the period, to keep people alive provided they remain lying down and don't work. Parisians were not lying down. They were trying to live, to feed children and elderly parents and sick relatives, to keep households running. And so the black market, what the French called the marché noir, became not an occasional temptation, but a daily necessity for most of the city. It had, as historians have noted, a strange universality. One academic described it as universally loathed and almost equally universally resorted to. People who despised it used it. People who considered it immoral participated in it, because the alternative was simply not enough to eat. The texture of the Parisian black market was extraordinary in its variety. At its most modest level, it was non-smokers quietly selling their tobacco coupons to smokers who needed them. It was neighbours breeding rabbits, and in some cases guinea pigs in their bathtubs to sell as a small protein supplement to the family down the hall. It was the unemployed man quietly exchanging his food tickets for cash, because keeping a roof over his head required money he didn't otherwise have. At the next level up, it was what the French called les cyclistes, the cyclists. Ordinary city people who would board a train or bicycle out to the countryside on weekends where food was somewhat more plentiful and quietly buy directly from farmers. They returned to Paris with concealed parcels tucked into bags and coat linings, a little butter here, a few eggs wrapped in cloth there, sometimes a small piece of meat. Enough to make a proper meal possible, enough to feel briefly like a person rather than a number on a ration form, and the farmers who sold to them. They did not in most cases experience themselves as lawbreakers. The official price ceilings for their produce were in many cases set below their actual cost of production. The Vichy government was requiring them to sell at a loss. Selling privately at a realistic price felt to most of them not like criminal activity, but like economic common sense. When researchers studied this period closely, they found that the black market in occupied France operated along two distinct logics. The first was profit, the obvious motivation of people who saw an opportunity to make money from shortage. The second was something more human and more complex, the desire to feed your family, your friends, your neighbours, your community. Two different motivations, two different kinds of people, but both operating in the same grey space between the law and what felt right. Back in America, the black market was playing out along its own particular lines. And in America, the villain of the piece, in the popular imagination at least, was meat. From the moment meat was added to the American rationing program in March of 1943, the shortage was acute and the temptation was immediate. Meat was as food, historians have noted, deeply embedded in the American sense of self, a symbol of success, of abundance, of what it meant to have made it. The Office of Price Administration estimated that roughly 17 to 20% of the entire national meat supply was trading through black market channels. 20%, 1/5 of all the meat in the country. The press coined a term for it that tells you everything you need to know about the cultural temperature of the moment. They called it meat-legging, as in bootlegging, as in the way illegal alcohol had moved through American society during Prohibition, because the comparison felt apt. People were going to have their meat the same way they had gone to have their whiskey, and no amount of government regulation was going to change that. The operations could be elaborate. Cattle were diverted from regulated markets and driven to unregistered slaughterhouses facilities that operated without government inspection, without health standards, and without any accountability whatsoever. The meat that came out of those places went straight onto black market distribution chains. One news report from 1943 described at least 800 head of cattle being diverted from a single market in a single day. 800 cattle gone into the shadow economy of American dinner tables. Here is where the story gets morally interesting, and I hope you'll stay with me through this because I think it's worth thinking about carefully. The Office of Price Administration's own administrator, a man named Chester Bowles, admitted openly that the majority of black market activity was not being conducted by professional criminals. He said, and I'm paraphrasing closely, most of our activity is concerned with violations on the part of hitherto reputable individuals or firms. Hitherto reputable, not gangsters, not organized crime, ordinary businesses. 1 in 15 American businesses, wholesale, retail and service, was charged with some form of illicit transaction during the war years. 1 in 15. And the Office of Price Administration's own figures showed that 1 in 5 of all business establishments in the country received at least a warning for suspected violations. These were not shadowy criminals. They were your local butcher, the shop owner on the corner, the wholesaler who supplied half the restaurants in town, people who had looked at the gap between what the law required and what their customers were asking for and had made a very human calculation. So where does that leave us morally? Let me be honest about this, because I think the honest answer is more interesting than the comfortable one. The black market was not a simple story of good citizens and bad criminals. It was a story about the limits of what people will accept and what they won't. In Britain, where the rationing system was widely seen as fair and the sacrifice felt genuinely shared, the black market stayed relatively modest. A false flaw here. A quiet transaction with a friendly shopkeeper there. Widespread, yes, but not systemic. In France, where the official ration provided starvation-level calories, and where the German occupation made the entire system feel not like collective sacrifice, but like theft, the black market became the real food supply for much of the population, not a supplement to the official system, a replacement for it. And in America, where the legal meat supply became genuinely difficult to find for months at a stretch, where, as one historical account put it, housewives trekked from market to market, just hoping to find frankfurters, the black market filled a gap that the official system couldn't close. In each case, the moral question was the same. At what point does following the rules become its own form of failure? At what point does a law that cannot be enforced, that 1 in 5 businesses is violating, stop being a law and start being a suggestion? I am not arguing that the black market was good. People were cheated. Food safety was compromised. The wealthy could always access more than the poor, and genuine profiteers made money from other people's hunger. Those things are real, and they matter. But I am suggesting that the black market is a window into something true about human nature. People will bend rules they don't believe in. People will break rules that threaten their ability to care for the people they love. And the line between those two things, bending and breaking convenience and desperation, is harder to draw in real life than it is on a government poster. There is a phrase I keep returning to from the research on wartime France. Historians studying the black market found that farmers who sold illegally often did not feel like criminals. They felt like people engaged in what one researcher called rational strategies, finding the best available means to take care of their families and their communities. And I wonder if that framing applies more broadly, not just to farmers hiding livestock, but to the British woman who bought a little extra from her shopkeeper without quite asking what extra coupons were supposed to be exchanged. And the American housewife who accepted the under-the-counter package from her butcher and didn't ask too many questions, and the Parisian cyclist who hid 24 eggs inside her coat on the train back from the countryside. They were all doing in their various ways the same thing. They were deciding that feeding their families was more important than a rule. And then they went home, put the eggs in the kitchen and made dinner. There is a sentence I want to read to you. It was spoken by someone who had been incarcerated, held behind barbed wire, and who was describing what they found when they arrived at the camp and what they left behind when the war ended and the gates finally opened. When we entered camp, it was a barren desert. When we left camp, it was a garden that had been built up without tools, in a barren desert, with barbed wire for walls and watchtowers for a skyline. I want to hold that sentence for a moment before we go anywhere else, because it tells you something about gardens, about the act of growing things that goes far deeper than food production. It tells you that when human beings are stripped of almost everything, the impulse that rises up, one of the most instinctive, most persistent impulses there is to put something into the ground and tend it, not because they have to, but because they need to. We have talked in earlier parts of this story about the Victory Garden as a government campaign. The posters, the propaganda, the Dig for Victory leaflets and the cheerful radio voices urging people to plant their allotments. All of that is true, and all of that matters. But there is another story inside the Victory Garden story, a quieter one, and in many ways a more profound one that the propaganda never quite captured. It is the story of what happens to a person when they put their hands in the earth, when they plant something, when they wait, when they tend, when weeks later something comes up. And I want to explore that story through 3 gardens. 3 very different gardens planted by very different people in 3 very different circumstances. The first garden is in Boston, or rather just outside Boston in the green belt of parks and pathways that the city calls the Back Bay Fens. In the spring of 1942, the Fenway Victory Gardens were established on land that had previously been lawn and ornamental plantings. Families arrived with their ration books and their seed packets, and their almost complete ignorance of how to grow food because most of them were city people who had never needed to know. They dug their plots. They made their rows. They planted beans and tomatoes and squash and Swiss chard, a vegetable that if you had asked most of them about it 18 months earlier, they would have struggled to identify. And they waited. Lorraine Meskin, who was a teenager in California during the same period, later described what she remembered about her community's Victory Gardens. Our whole social life, she said, was built around the war, around the garden specifically, around the shared work and the shared knowledge, the experienced gardener, 2 plots over showing you how to thin your seedlings, the neighbour offering you tomato starts because she had too many, the slow communal accumulation of skill in a community that had started from almost nothing. Something happened in these spaces that had nothing to do with food production. Fences came down, or rather no fences went up. In a country where race and class and neighbourhood affiliation kept people in carefully maintained separations, the Victory Garden plots pressed people up against each other, elbow to elbow, plot to plot. You could not grow tomatoes in silence and solitude when someone's bean vines were threading through your fence. You had to talk, you had to negotiate, sometimes you had to share. And in the sharing, the casual, soil-grimed, slightly competitive sharing of people who were all trying to figure out the same thing, something neighbourly happened. By 1943, the Fenway Victory Gardens were producing food. Real food. Not supplement to the ration book food, but genuine pride-producing look-what-I-grew food. Nearly 20,000 community gardens like them were scattered across the United States that year. 12 million in cities, 6 million on farms, and together they were producing approximately 40% of all the fresh vegetables consumed by the American civilian population. 40%. 2 in every 5 vegetables on an American dinner table in 1943 came from someone's backyard or a community plot or a hotel grounds or a rooftop in Brooklyn. Not from a factory, not from a distribution system, from someone's hands and someone's time and someone's patient attention to a piece of ground. The United States Department of Agriculture had initially been skeptical about the whole enterprise. Professional agricultural officials worried that amateur gardeners would waste seeds and cause more problems than they solved. They lobbied against the program in its early months. But the numbers silenced the objections. In 1943, the government's own data showed that Victory Gardens were providing a genuine and substantial contribution to the national food supply, one that the commercial agriculture system under wartime strain simply could not have managed alone. And still the statistics tell only part of the story. The second garden I want to tell you about is in Britain, specifically in the shadow of one of the most recognisable monuments in the world. In 1942, allotment plots were dug in the park grounds surrounding the Albert Memorial in the heart of London. Onions, growing in the shadow of the Albert Memorial. There is something about that image that I find quietly extraordinary. Not the onions themselves, though onions were precious enough in wartime Britain that they were raffled off as prizes at local fundraisers, but the location. The Albert Memorial was commissioned by Queen Victoria after the death of Prince Albert. It is ornate gilded, imposing one of the most unapologetically grand monuments in a city that was not short of grand monuments. It was designed to make you feel the weight of empire and history, and in 1942 people were growing vegetables in its shadow. Because at the same moment both Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle had their ornamental gardens replaced with vegetable plots at the personal direction of King George VI. If the king was growing carrots, the Albert Memorial could grow onions. But here is what strikes me most about the British allotment experience beyond the numbers and the symbols. It was for many of the people who participated the first time they had ever grown anything. A radio gardening program called In Your Garden, presented by a beloved broadcaster named Charles Middleton, drew 3.5 million listeners every Sunday afternoon during the war years. 3.5 million people, sitting around the radio, learning how to grow potatoes, and then going out and doing it. People who had lived their entire lives on streets of terraced houses, who had never needed a garden because food had always come from shops, who had no tools and no experience, and often barely enough outdoor space for a washing line. These people learned to grow food because they had to, because someone showed them how, and because it turned out to be something they were capable of. The sense of capability that came from the allotment, the discovery that you could do this, that these hands, which had always worked a typewriter or a sewing machine or a factory machine, could also coax something edible from English soil, was by many accounts one of the unexpectedly sustaining gifts of the wartime kitchen. You did not need to wait for a butcher or a grocer or a rationing board to decide what you were permitted to eat. You could grow it yourself, and no coupon in the world could take that away from you. The third garden. This one is harder to talk about, but I think it is the most important of the three, and I want to make sure I do it justice. It is on the other side of the country from Boston, in the Owens Valley of California in the high desert, on the eastern edge of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The place is called Manzanar. In March of 1942, following an executive order signed by President Franklin Roosevelt, over 10,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of them American citizens by birth, were transported to Manzanar and held there behind barbed wire and armed guard towers. They had been given days, sometimes hours, to abandon their homes, their businesses, their farms, to sell everything or leave it behind or entrust it to neighbours they hoped they could trust, and then to board buses and trains with whatever they could carry and arrive at a place in the desert That was, as one internee wrote, a barren landscape of dust and wind and bleakness. They had done nothing wrong. They were guilty of nothing. Their incarceration was, as a congressional commission would find decades later, the product of, in the commission's own words, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. And in that place, behind that wire, in that desert, they planted gardens, not because a government pamphlet told them to, not because of propaganda posters, but because, and here I need you to hold this very carefully, it was the one act that no wire, no guard tower, no executive order could take from them. They could not choose to be free. They could not choose to go home. They could not choose most of the conditions of their daily lives, but they could choose to put something in the ground. And they could choose what grew. What they built at Manzanar was extraordinary. Using rocks and boulders carried from the surrounding desert, some of them weighing over a ton in turnies, created traditional Japanese garden ponds with stone arrangements representing cranes and tortoises, symbols of long life. They transplanted native sagebrush and brought home clumps of wild grass mint plants, cattail reeds, and willows from the surrounding land. They made their own irrigation channels. They built ornamental gardens of genuine artistry in the fire breaks between the barracks. A man named Yasusuke Kogita hauled a massive lava rock, which his family called Stovepipe Rock, across the desert sagelands and installed it as the centerpiece of a garden outside his block. A garden inside a concentration camp. Scholars who have studied these gardens have described them as, and I am quoting from a landscape architecture journal, places of adoration, symbols of strength and capacity, and testaments to a human connection, to place forged out of prison-like landscapes. One of the most thoughtful descriptions I have ever read of what gardens actually mean. Not food production, not patriotic duty, connection to place, forged out of prison. Now I want to step back and ask the question that I think ties all three of these gardens together. Why? When you have almost nothing, when you are rationed and restricted, and in some cases physically imprisoned, does the impulse to grow things persist? What is it about a garden that the human animal will not give up even in extremity? I think part of the answer is time. A garden is a commitment to the future. When you plant something, you are saying, I believe I will still be here when this comes up. I believe the world will still exist in a form worth caring about. I believe that what I do now will matter later. In wartime, when the future was genuinely uncertain, when nobody knew what next month would bring, let alone next year, that act of planting was a profound statement of hope. Not the cheerful propaganda poster kind of hope. The quiet, stubborn hands in the earth kind of hope. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. It just puts the seed in the ground and waits. There is one more thread to this story that I don't want to leave unexamined. The Fenway Victory Gardens in Boston are still there, still cultivated, still growing food. More than 80 years after they were first planted in wartime by people who mostly had no idea what they were doing. They're one of the last surviving public examples from the Second World War Victory Garden movement, and they are there because the community that grew around those plots refused to let them be taken away when the war ended, and the official need for them was gone, because something had happened in those gardens that went beyond food. A woman who gardened at Fenway in the post-war years, interviewed for a historical record of the site, said something I have been thinking about ever since. She said she came to the garden originally because of the vegetables, but she stayed because of the people, and she came back every year for decades because the garden was where she felt she understood something about herself that she could not quite access anywhere else. What was that thing? She couldn't put it precisely into words, but I think I understand it. It is the feeling of being useful in the most direct, most unmediated way possible. You put in, something comes out. You feed people. No bureaucracy, no rationing board, no exchange of coupons, just soil and seed and time, and then dinner. The Dig for Victory campaign ended when the war ended. The Victory Garden movement was wound down when the food supply normalised. The allotments at the Albert Memorial were removed. The plots at Buckingham Palace went back to ornamental gardens. But something lingered. In the people who had grown things for the first time, in the communities that had built something together in the dirt, in the quiet, stubborn knowledge that you could do this, that the earth, if you asked it properly, would give you food. And in Manzanar, where the gardens remained after the internees were released and the camp was closed, the rock arrangements are still there today. The pond sites are still visible. The National Park Service has been carefully restoring and preserving them. Because those gardens built without tools in a desert prison by American citizens who have been stripped of almost everything else, those gardens are in the judgment of the people who study them among the most significant cultural landscapes in all of North America. Not despite the circumstances in which they were built, because of them. The desert tried to be empty. The people who were put there refused to let it stay that way. They planted gardens. Can I tell you about the moment the war ended? Not the political moment. Not the generals signing surrender documents or the crowds in Trafalgar Square. The kitchen moment. The moment when in the weeks and months following the armistice in Europe in May of 1945, something began reappearing in British shops and market stalls for the first time in 6 years. Bananas. Just bananas. Ordinary yellow, utterly unremarkable bananas, and something happened across Britain that nobody had anticipated. Children didn't know what to do with them. They had never seen one. Some of the older ones had a dim memory of the word of adults using it with that particular tone of fond, wistful loss. But the children who were born in 1939 or 1940, the ones who had grown up entirely inside the war, had no frame of reference whatsoever. They held this strange yellow object in their hands. Some of them tried to eat it with the skin still on. Others peeled it and looked at the pale fruit inside with deep suspicion. A few took a cautious bite and then only then understood what all the fuss had been about. There are accounts of this moment scattered through wartime memoirs and oral history collections, and I have found it impossible to read them without feeling something catch in my chest, because what it tells you in the most gentle and ordinary way imaginable is just how completely the war had remade the world these children knew. Feeding children during the Second World War was in many ways the most complicated and emotionally weighted part of the entire wartime kitchen story, because adults could accept scarcity. They could understand rationing in ideological terms. They could tell themselves and genuinely mean it that going without was a form of participation in something larger. But children don't experience scarcity ideologically. They experience it in the stomach and in the moment, and without the context that makes sacrifice feel purposeful rather than simply confusing. When a child asked why there was no pudding, the truthful answer was complicated, because the sugar allocation for the week had run out, because the merchant ships bringing cane sugar from the West Indies were being hunted by German submarines, because of strategic military priorities and the logistics of global conflict. Most mothers simply said because there isn't any, and then moved on to the next thing. That gap between the geopolitical reality and the child's unanswered question was one of the countless small heartbreaks of the wartime kitchen. But here is the thing that surprised me most in researching this part of the story. And I need you to hold this carefully, because it seems counterintuitive at first. The children of the Second World War, particularly British children, were by the end of the conflict physically healthier than they had been at the beginning. Not marginally healthier, measurably, documentably, statistically healthier. Infant mortality rates in Britain fell to their lowest levels ever recorded during the war years. The rate of stillbirths dropped to 3/4 of what it had been before the war. Children who grew up on wartime rations were on average taller and sturdier than the generation before them. Rickets declined. Tooth decay declined counterintuitively because sugar was rationed. Tuberculosis deaths among children fell. The British government's own chief medical officer, Dr. Wilson Jameson, broadcast these results to the nation in December of 1944. He said, speaking on the radio, "After 5 years of war, we still have a good story to tell. The most sensitive index of a nation's general health is probably the proportion of infants dying in the first year of life. In the last war, it rose steadily. During the last 3 years, it has declined steadily, and last year was the lowest ever recorded. The lowest ever recorded. During a world war. How? The answer lies in one of the most deliberate and far-sighted decisions of the entire rationing system. Someone specifically, a biochemist named Jack Drummond, working as the government's wartime nutritional advisor, had decided early in the war that the rationing system would not be designed simply to distribute what was available. It would be designed to prioritize who needed what most, and children and pregnant women were at the top of that list. While ordinary adults received a weekly ration of 1 egg, if an egg was available at all, children received priority access to additional eggs and milk. While ordinary adults received no free supplements of any kind, children under the age of 2 received blackcurrant syrup free of charge, later replaced by bottled orange juice sent from America. Pregnant women and nursing mothers received subsidized milk and had first access to whatever fresh fruit managed to reach the shops. The Green Ration book issued to children under 5 entitled them to a daily pint of milk double the ordinary adult allocation, and there was cod liver oil. I want to take a moment with the cod liver oil because it represents something genuinely moving about this period when you understand the context. The Ministry of Health had identified in the early months of the war that children, particularly urban children living in the blackout, getting less sunlight, eating restricted diets, were at risk of vitamin deficiency. Vitamin D deficiency specifically, which causes rickets. The solution was cod liver oil, which if you have never taken it is not something that makes you think, yes, please more of that. It is oily. It has a strong, distinctly fishy taste. It leaves an aftertaste that persists. For small children, it was a daily encounter with something they almost universally hated. And yet, millions of British children lined up for their daily spoonful. Mothers administered it firmly. Children swallowed and made faces, and the rickets stayed away. One elderly man interviewed decades later for an oral history project described growing up in Scotland during the war. He said his mother would pour big spoonfuls of cod liver oil into him before school. He remembered it vividly, the smell, the taste, the shudder that came after. But he also said with what sounded like genuine pride, "We were an extremely healthy family." There is something in that testimony that I find deeply affecting. The cod liver oil was not pleasant. The spoon was not offered with apology. It was administered because his mother understood in whatever practical way mothers understood such things, that her job was not only to feed him what he wanted, her job was to feed him what he needed. And so she did. Every morning for years, without ceremony or complaint. That is love in a spoon. There is another chapter of the wartime child nutrition story that most people outside Britain have never heard of. It involves rose hips. In the summer and autumn, wild rose hips, the small red oval seed pods of the dog rose grew in abundance, along British hedgerows and in the countryside. And when the war disrupted blackcurrant supplies and made obtaining vitamin C for children genuinely difficult, someone at the Ministry of Health looked at the research from Kew Gardens and had a realization. Rosehips were, according to that research, a nutritional powerhouse. Weight for weight, they contained more vitamin C than almost any other plant material available in Britain, and they were free, growing wild, everywhere, in a country that needed vitamin C urgently, and couldn't easily import the citrus fruit that would normally provide it. And so the government created something called the Rosehip Products Association, and it recruited the children through schools, through scouts and girl guides, through local community organisations. Children across Britain were enlisted as rosehip gatherers. They went out into the fields and hedgerows in the autumn with baskets and bags, picking the small red pods from the brambles. They brought them to collection points where the hips were weighed and sent to facilities around the country to be processed into national rosehip syrup, a standardised product, a measured dose of a teaspoon a day for young children, each teaspoon providing half a child's daily vitamin C requirement. Millions of children spent wartime autumns picking rosehips in the countryside, and the vitamin C that those rosehips provided helped protect a generation from the effects of a restricted wartime diet. It is one of the most quietly ingenious things about the entire wartime nutrition story. The children gathered their own medicine from the hedges. They just didn't know that's what they were doing. You might be wondering, and it would be a fair thing to wonder how the mothers of these children felt. Feeding a child when you are rationed, when the sweet ration is 12 ounces for a 4-week period, barely a child's handful of sweets. When there is no chocolate, no ice cream, no birthday cake in the ordinary sense. When the birthday cake, if there is one, is made with dried eggs and artificial sweetener and mock cream and decorated as bravely as its creator can manage. Graham Zeitling, who was 9 years old when the war started and kept clear memories of those years, recorded his recollections for the Imperial War Museum. He said that for 6 years, he never saw a banana or an orange or any tropical fruit at all. His mother cooked with what was available. She made potatoes in at least a dozen different ways, he said. He had 3 meals a day. He did not go hungry. And then he added something that I think says everything. It was the mother that had the problem. Not him, not the child, the mother. She was the one who had to find the coupons. She was the one who had to stretch the ration. She was the one who had to look at what was available and make it seem to an 8-year-old like enough. He didn't suffer. She made sure of that, by suffering the problem quietly in his place. The school lunch program was another quiet revolution of the wartime kitchen that deserves its own moment. Before the war, school meals in Britain were relatively uncommon, available primarily in schools serving the poorest areas and on a limited scale. By 1945, 1.6 million school meals were being served every day in British schools. That is 10 times the pre-war number. 10 times. And by 1944 it had become a legal requirement that those meals be balanced and nutritious, with provisions to make them free for children whose families couldn't afford them. Children were receiving up to 1,000 calories a day at school, a substantial portion of their nutritional needs prepared by school kitchens and served in school canteens that were for many working-class children their first experience of eating a hot meal somewhere other than home. This was quietly and without fanfare a fundamental shift in how British society thought about feeding children, not just as a family responsibility, but as a collective one. The school meal was wartime policy, but the principle it embedded that every child deserves a nutritious meal regardless of what their family can provide would go on to shape British educational policy for decades. Now I want to bring you to a moment in 1945 that I think captures something essential about all of this. The war in Europe had just ended. Rationing was not over, it would continue, in some cases becoming even stricter in the months ahead. But for a brief euphoric stretch of days following the German surrender, something was in the air. And in that atmosphere, adults did something remarkable. They gave their sweet rations to the children. Individual men and women all across Britain chose in the first days of peace to redirect their allowance of sweets 12 ounces in 4 weeks, already a meagre thing entirely, to the nearest child. Not as a grand gesture, not as something organised or politically significant, just as an impulse, a reaching into the pocket and a handing over, because all those years of keeping the sweets away from the children, not out of cruelty but out of constraint, had built up into a debt of tenderness that now briefly could be paid. Historians who have studied the home front in detail note this pattern in diaries and letters from the period. The automatic instinctive desire to give the good thing to the child. Before the adults themselves ate, before the rationing was even formally relaxed, it had always been there. The war had simply tested it, stretched it, held it in tension for years, and in the first days of peace it released. There is a detail about the birthday cakes of wartime Britain that I cannot leave out. Ordinary birthday cakes, the kind requiring eggs and real butter and generous amounts of sugar and frosting, were essentially impossible for most families. And so there were two solutions. The first was what historians have called the neighbourhood approach. When a special occasion required cake, families across a street or a block of flats would quietly pool their sugar rations. A little from here, a little from there. Enough for one proper cake for one child's birthday. The second solution was more dramatic. Wedding cakes were sometimes made from cardboard. The elaborate tiered confections that British couples had displayed at their receptions were replaced for much of the war with beautiful hollow structures made from white cardboard and plaster. The real cake, small, modest, made with whatever could be scraped together, was hidden inside. When the time came for the cake to be cut, the cardboard tower was removed with ceremony, and the small real cake appeared underneath. There is a metaphor in that image somewhere. The grand exterior of the occasion preserved. The real thing, small and genuine, hidden inside. The wartime party in a shell. What I find most moving about this whole chapter of the wartime kitchen feeding children, protecting them from the full weight of what was happening around them, is not the sacrifice. It's not the spoonfuls of cod liver oil, or the 12 ounces of sweets, or the saved-up sugar rations pooled for a birthday cake. It is the determination, the stubborn, unspectacular, every-single-day determination to make the table look like enough. Even when it wasn't. Even when the mother knew, counting in her head, that this week was going to be tight. To put a plate down and call it dinner. To light a candle on a wartime cake, however small, however make do, and say this day is worth celebrating. That is not the history that gets written about. It is too ordinary, too kitchen-bound, too quiet. But I am convinced that it is in some way the history that matters most. The everyday determination of people trying to give their children a childhood inside a war. What if I told you that the most important person in Britain's entire war effort was not a general, not a politician, not a factory owner or a shipbuilder or a code breaker? What if I told you it was a biochemist, a slightly dishevelled scientist who spent his days thinking about vitamins and his evenings reading 500 years of British food history, a man who had never commanded a battalion or addressed Parliament? A man whose name almost nobody knows today. And yet, the American Public Health Association, presenting him with their highest honour after the war ended, said his work was, and I am quoting them directly, one of the greatest demonstrations in public health administration that the world has ever seen. One of the greatest demonstrations in public health administration in the world ever. His name was Jack Drummond, and what he did with the nation's rationing system, and specifically what he saw in it, that nobody else had yet seen, changed the course of British history in ways that echo all the way to the present day. Jack Cecil Drummond was born in Leicester in January of 1891. He studied chemistry, moved into biochemistry, and by 1914 was working at a cancer research institute in London, alongside a Polish biochemist named Casimir Funk. Casimir Funk is worth pausing on for a moment. He was the man who coined the word vitamin, later shortened by Drummond himself to the form we use today, vitamin, as in vitamins A, B, and C. Drummond didn't just work alongside the man who invented the concept of vitamins. He went on to identify and name 3 of the most important ones. By the time war broke out in 1939, Drummond was a Fellow of the Royal Society Professor of Biochemistry at University College London, and the author of a book that had taken him years to research a 500-year history of the English diet, called without particular drama, The Englishman's Food. That book was not just a history, it was a diagnosis. What Drummond found sifting through centuries of eating records was that Britain had always eaten badly. The wealthy ate too much of the wrong things, too much meat, too much fat, too many sweet puddings. The poor ate too little of almost everything, and the gap between the diet of the rich and the diet of the poor was in nutritional terms one of the most persistent sources of preventable illness in the country. He published this finding in 1939. And then almost immediately the war arrived and put him in a position to do something about it. On the first day of February 1940, Jack Drummond was appointed scientific advisor to the Ministry of Food. He was 49 years old. He had spent 30 years studying what people ate and what it did to them, and now suddenly he had something no nutrition scientist had ever had before. Power, not symbolic power. Actual operational policy-shaping power over what 50 million people ate. When Lord Woolton became Minister of Food that same spring, he and Drummond sat down together and Drummond made a proposal that was for its time quietly radical. He said rationing is not just a distribution problem, it is an opportunity. Because if you control what people eat, if you have the ability to decide what comes in, what gets allocated, who gets more and who gets less, then you can, for the first time in British history, impose a scientifically sound diet on the entire population, not because anyone asked for it, not because the population wanted it, but because the circumstances of war had created the conditions for it. He saw the crisis as a laboratory, and he was right. Let me tell you exactly what Drummond changed. Before the war, margarine was a nutritional blank, cheap, fat little else. Drummond required vitamins A and D to be added to all margarine sold in Britain. Every purchase of the butter substitute that millions of poorer families relied on was now also delivering nutrients they had previously gone without. The national bread loaf, white, fluffy, nutritionally poor, was replaced by the national wheatmeal loaf, dense, darker, far less popular, but made with whole grain flour that retained the vitamins and minerals that the milling process had previously discarded, and calcium carbonate was added to the flour to provide the calcium that the wartime diet otherwise lacked. These were not changes anyone asked for. People hated the national wheatmeal loaf. They called it grey, gummy, unpleasant. One journalist described it as tasting like eating wet cardboard. But it was better for them, and Drummond knew it. And Drummond, who had the ear of Churchill and the authority of the ministry, insisted on it anyway. Sugar imports were cut to what he calculated as 19th century levels, deliberately, because the existing sugar consumption was in his view a driver of dental decay and metabolic disease. And then there was his most audacious calculation. The Atlantic convoys, those precious lines of cargo ships threading through the U-boat hunting grounds, had limited space. Every ton of cargo had to be chosen carefully. Drummond looked at what was being imported and made a decision that sounds almost brutally rational. Stop importing eggs in shells. Stop importing heavy water-laden citrus fruits. Stop importing things that took up cargo space with weight that was mostly water or packaging. Instead, import dried eggs, import dried milk powder, import concentrated orange juice. The new food technologies of drying and condensing, developed partly through the wartime research effort, could pack the nutritional equivalent of far more food into far less cargo space. 500,000 tons of shipping was going to the bottom of the Atlantic every month at the worst point of the war. Every cubic foot of cargo space was a decision with mortal consequences. Drummond made these decisions scientifically. Who needed what most? In what form could it travel? And how could the least cargo space produce the most nutritional benefit? Now here is where the story gets genuinely paradoxical, and I want you to sit with this for a moment because it challenges a number of assumptions we tend to hold about hardship and health. Britain during the Second World War was by any ordinary measure a country in crisis. Food was scarce, people were stressed, cities were being bombed, families were separated. The future was uncertain in a way that peacetime never quite manages to replicate. And yet, the British population overall measurably was healthier in 1945 than it had been in 1939. Not marginally healthier, not healthy given the circumstances healthier. Genuinely statistically documentably healthier. Infant mortality fell to its lowest ever recorded level. Life expectancy rose. Tuberculosis rates declined. Dental disease declined. Heart disease rates were lower than pre-war levels. How? The answer is Drummond's great insight, the one he'd been building toward for 30 years of research. The pre-war British diet, particularly the diet of the poor, had been nutritionally inadequate. Not dramatically inadequate in a visible starvation level way, but chronically inadequate in the quiet cumulative way that causes disease over decades. Too much fat, too much sugar, too little of the vitamins and minerals that the body needs to function properly. What rationing did what Drummond designed it to do was force the wealthy to eat less of what was harming them, and force the poor to eat more of what was helping them. He described this in his own papers as his opportunity to attack what he called dietetic ignorance. And wartime gave him that opportunity, because nobody could choose to opt out. The ration book was the same for everyone. At this point, I want to step back and ask you something. Does this make you slightly uncomfortable? A government scientist operating under wartime emergency powers, using a national crisis to reshape an entire population's diet, according to his own scientific principles, whether they wanted it or not, I find it genuinely fascinating to sit with that discomfort. Because Drummond was right. The results proved it. The health of the nation improved, but the mechanism by which it improved was essentially coercive. Nobody voted for the national wheatmeal loaf. Nobody chose to have their margarine fortified with vitamins. Nobody consented to have their sugar consumption reduced to 19th century levels. It happened to them, for their own good. By a biochemist who had spent 30 years being quite certain he knew better than the population what the population should eat. That tension between scientific authority and personal freedom, between what is good for you and what you have the right to choose, did not end with the war. It is in many ways the defining tension of modern public health. We're still living inside it today. Every time a government debates sugar taxes or food labelling or what can and cannot be sold, in a school cafeteria, that argument has roots in what Jack Drummond did in the 1940s. He was the first to demonstrate at national scale that you could engineer a healthier diet through policy, and the demonstration was so successful that it has been both celebrated and argued about ever since. Now I need to take you somewhere darker, because the Drummond story, the story of scientific nutrition applied intelligently in a crisis, has a shadow that makes it more meaningful. The Netherlands, the winter of 1944 to 1945. In September of 1944, German forces imposed a food and fuel embargo on the western provinces of the occupied Netherlands as retaliation for a Dutch railway strike that had been called in support of the Allied liberation effort. An exceptionally harsh winter followed. Supply chains into the cities collapsed, and 4.5 million Dutch civilians, ordinary people in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Utrecht, found themselves in a rapidly deepening famine. By November of 1944, the official daily ration in the Dutch cities had dropped to 1,000 calories. By February of 1945, it had fallen to 580 calories, less than 600 calories per day, per person. For reference, an adult at rest, simply sitting still and breathing, burns roughly 1,200 to 1,500 calories per day, just to maintain basic body functions. At 580 calories, people were not being rationed. They were slowly starving, and they ate what they could find. Sugar beets which left sore throats when eaten raw, tulip bulbs boiled into a starchy paste, potato peels, wild nettles, anything. 25,000 people died, possibly more, the elderly, the very young, the already vulnerable. But the hunger winter, as it came to be known in Dutch collective memory, did something else, something that scientists are still studying today. The babies who were conceived and developed in the womb during those months of famine were marked by it in ways that lasted their entire lives. Researchers who followed the Dutch famine birth cohort, the children born to mothers who were starving during the hunger winter, found elevated rates of diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease decades later. Not from choices those people made as adults, but from what happened to them before they were born, from the food their mothers could not eat. One baby conceived during the hunger winter, who would later become one of the most famous people in Hollywood, was a young girl named Audrey Hepburn. Famous for her remarkable slenderness, which she later attributed directly to what the famine had done to her body in childhood and in utero. She said her digestion was never the same. For the rest of her life she struggled with the consequences of those months of starvation. The most elegant person in cinema, and the thing that made her look that way, was hunger. Hold both of these stories at once if you can. Britain, with its imperfect but scientifically designed rationing system, emerging from the war with its population measurably healthier than before. The Netherlands, with its imposed German starvation, leaving a generation marked for life by what they were denied. The difference between them is not luck. It is not geography or culture or any inherent quality of the people involved. The difference is the presence or absence of someone like Jack Drummond. Someone who understood that food is medicine, that what a population eats is not just a matter of personal taste or cultural habit, that it is in the deepest sense a matter of survival, and that survival can be designed. After the war, Drummond was knighted for his work. He received the Medal of Freedom from the United States. He was awarded an honorary doctorate from the Sorbonne in Paris. The American Public Health Association cited his work as one of the greatest demonstrations of public health achievement in history. And then in August of 1952, he was murdered. He and his wife Anne, who had co-authored The Englishman's Food with him, and their young daughter were on holiday in southern France. They pulled off a road in Provence to sleep the night in their car. In the morning, Jack and Anne were found shot dead beside the vehicle. Their 10-year-old daughter Elizabeth was found nearby beaten. A 75-year-old farmer named Gaston Dominici was arrested and convicted of the murders. He was sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment, and released in 1960 on grounds of age and ill health. His family has always insisted on his innocence. The case has never been satisfactorily resolved. It remains one of France's most debated cold cases. The man who designed the diet that saved Britain died alone in a field in Provence, murdered, for reasons nobody has ever definitively established. History is sometimes profoundly strange. Right now in your kitchen, there is probably at least one thing that exists because of the Second World War, not in a vague cultural influence kind of way, but in a direct this specific product was developed for military rations kind of way. Instant coffee military contract, frozen orange juice concentrate military research project. the cheese powder that coats a certain very popular corn snack, dehydrated cheese developed by a government scientist in 1943 for combat rations, and the candy-coated chocolates that melt in your mouth and not in your hand, created specifically so they wouldn't melt in a soldier's pocket on the way to battle. I want to tell you about the other side of the wartime food story, not the kitchen, not the ration book, not the allotment or the victory garden, the field, the foxhole, the supply chain that had to stretch somehow across oceans and deserts and jungles and frozen European winters. Because the challenge of feeding a civilian population on tight rations was genuinely difficult, but the challenge of feeding an army of millions of men in active combat, that was something else entirely. To understand military food in the Second World War, you first need to understand the scale of the problem. By the end of the war, the United States alone had 16 million people in active military service. 16 million mouths scattered across every climate and terrain on Earth. In the North African desert, where temperatures reached 50 degrees Celsius in the sun. In the Pacific jungles, where humidity rotted almost everything within days. On the North Atlantic in winter, where temperature swings could split metal and freeze anything liquid. In the mountains of Italy, where soldiers climbed so high that their metabolism was burning calories at rates military planners had never anticipated. More than 1 billion individual ration packages were produced during the Second World War. 1 billion. And each of those rations had to be compact enough to carry, lightweight enough to transport across impractical terrain, durable enough to survive temperatures ranging from negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit to 135 degrees Fahrenheit, nutritionally adequate, and this is the one that proved hardest to achieve edible enough that soldiers would actually consume them rather than throw them away. That last requirement turned out to be the sticking point, because the problem was not just whether you could make food last for months in a metal can. The problem was whether a hungry soldier in a foxhole after 3 weeks of eating the same thing would still eat it rather than leave it behind. The K-ration was designed by a physiologist named Ancel Keys in 1941. The K, some people say, stood for Keys himself. Others say it stood for commando, since the ration was originally designed for paratroopers and airborne troops who needed to carry 3 days of food in their pockets while jumping out of aircraft. It was compact and clever. Each day's supply, breakfast, dinner and supper came in 3 separately boxed units. Together they weighed just over 33 ounces, 2 pounds of food for an entire day. Inside each unit a small tin of processed meat or cheese biscuits similar to crackers, a compressed cereal bar, some hard candy, instant coffee, cigarettes, in some versions, and various small accessories. The total caloric content for the day was approximately 2,830 calories, which if you are sitting at a desk in a temperate climate is probably enough. If you're carrying a 60-pound pack up a mountain in Italy while being shot at, it is not nearly enough. Military planners discovered this problem too late. A 1943 field report from the European Theatre of Operations noted bluntly that none of the packaged rations were recommended for continued use by active troops for periods in excess of 10 days. Soldiers who had been living primarily on K-rations for 5 months, like the men of Merrill's Marauders fighting in Burma, lost an average of 35 pounds per man. That is not a diet. That is starvation at military pace. Ask any veteran of the Second World War about sea rations and you will get one of 2 responses. Either a philosophical shrug, they kept us alive, or something rather more colourful that I will not repeat here. The sea ration was the standard combat ration for the American soldier. A day's worth of food in 6 cans, 3 meat-based units, 3 bread and dessert units, and an accessory packet. The options included combinations with names like meat and beans, ham, egg, and potato, pork and rice, and perhaps most infamously ham and lima beans. Ham and lima beans. This dish appeared in military rations during the Second World War. It stayed through the Korean War. It stayed through the Vietnam War. Decades of soldiers complained about it in the most emphatic possible terms. Every field report noted that it was the least popular item, and every year someone continued to include it in the ration. The mystery of why ham and lima beans survived for so long in the American military food system, when everyone from the infantry to the medical corps agreed it was universally despised, is, I think, one of the more enduring bureaucratic puzzles of the 20th century. But it also tells you something true about the challenge of feeding people at scale. When you're procuring food for 16 million people simultaneously, you cannot please everyone. You can barely please anyone. You aim for adequacy, and then you aim to survive the complaints. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When you look at that list of C-ration contents, the processed meats, the hard biscuits, the powdered beverages, the candy bars, does any of it sound familiar? It should. Because many of the things that the military developed or popularized as field rations during the Second World War did not disappear when the war ended. They migrated into civilian life, into your grocery store, into your kitchen, and I think the journey of some of those foods from the battlefield to the breakfast table is one of the most fascinating and underappreciated stories in the entire history of modern eating. Start with M&M's. In the 1930s, Forrest Mars, senior son of the Mars Candy Company founder, was traveling in Europe during the Spanish Civil War. He observed soldiers eating small chocolate pellets coated in a hard sugar shell. The coating kept the chocolate from melting in the heat of battle. He came back to America and patented the concept. In 1941, he launched the candy with a business partner named Bruce Murray Mars, plus Murray, hence the name. And from the moment the United States entered the war, M&M's had an exclusive military contract. They went into the C-ration accessory packs, the K-ration units, anywhere that soldiers needed a quick calorie hit that would survive the temperatures that destroyed other chocolate. The soldiers ate them, liked them, and when they came home they asked